Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure as the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre to welcome you to the 8th John Howard Lecture. It is, of course, my honour on these occasions, my great pleasure to introduce the man after whom these lectures are named. He's Australia's 25th Prime Minister. He was the second longest serving Prime Minister, and at the time when he was elected, he was only the second Liberal leader to lead the party from opposition into government. He's our greatest living statesman. Please give a round of applause for John Howard.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, to Paul Espy, the Chairman of the Menzies Research Centre, to John and Julia Anderson, to Philip Roke and other former colleagues. I'm really delighted to be here tonight in association with and in friendship with my former deputy and close colleague, John Anderson. I said on the night of the 2004 election, and that was the last one that my government won, of course, we sort of fell by the wayside in 2007. I said on that occasion that I had not met a more honourable person in public life than John Anderson. He was more than just a colleague and friend. He was a trusted partnership in the government of this country for a very long period of time. And it's worth remembering that at his retirement press conference, Robert Gordon Menzies was asked what were the two achievements of which he was most proud in the time that he'd been Prime Minister. And the one that he nominated that is relevant tonight is the coalition between the Liberal Party and the then Country Party, later the National Country Party and then the National Party. The partnership between Menzies and Fadden and then Menzies and McEwen was a template for the partnership between Malcolm Fraser and Doug Anthony, and was also the guiding light to the partnership that I had first with Tim Fischer, then for a very long period of time with John Anderson, and then finally with Mark Vaile. We had our differences, as you always do in partnerships, but there was always total trust between the two parties. We had grown closer together on economic policy by the time that my government came to power. We had some differences of emphasis. Occasionally Liberals would grumble about special arrangements being made for particular parts of Australia, and I would say to them, why not? And they didn't really have an answer for that. But fundamentally, there was such deep respect between the two parties that we solved problems together. And of course the testament to that was that we stayed in office for almost 12 years and we got back into office fairly quickly after that. There may have been the odd contribution from the other side of politics to that phenomenon, but whatever it was, and the partnership between Warren Truss and Tony Abbott, and now the partnership between Scott Morrison and Michael McCormack follows in that very long tradition. But tonight I particularly honour my close friend, former Deputy Prime Minister, and somebody who's made a magnificent contribution to public life and has carried it on. I think his online presentations are fantastic. He's a person who's got a very deep commitment to what are the important social values of our society which transcend political differences. He's committed to a better Australia in the best sense of that word. And of course he is at heart a farmer, a fifth generation wheat grower, and he's very proud of the fact that one of his sons is now running the property, although I think they let Mum and Dad reside there, and I think Mum and Dad are very pleased about that. But I couldn't be happier tonight in introducing my dear friend John Anderson to deliver the Howard Lecture. Thank you.
and I couldn't be more honoured to have the opportunity. But to Paul Espy and to Nick Cater, to Philip Ruddock, I think John Sharp is watching on tonight elsewhere. You'll forgive me if I also acknowledge Heather Henderson, who I think is with us tonight as well in this new virtual world, daughter, of course, of Robert Menzies, for which this magnificent institution is named. She's lost none of her fighting spirit. In a very brief toast to the future of my own party in Canberra last week that she was kindly at, it was the unveiling of a statue of Blackjack McEwen. And I was able to say a few words and propose a toast to the future of my own party. I'm sure you'd all join me in that as well. And I slightly misquoted the book that she, I think, blessed us with when I said that she had done us a great service by being responsible for the launching of the book, Letters from My Father. Clear as a bell, out came, Letters to My Daughter. But it was a magnificent book and I thoroughly recommend it. So what a fantastic person she is. And it's great to think that she's joining us tonight out of her commitment really to good public policy as well as to her friends in the Liberal Party and the friends of the Liberal Party. But thank you, Nick, in particular. I'll say a bit more about the importance of Menzies and supporting Menzies later on, but I do want to thank you again for having me to speak here tonight. John, you're right, our children do tolerate us on the place, particularly at harvest time. So you see, we've escaped the harvest. We had one for the first one since 2016. And I'm the bloke, you see, who gets to drive the old wheat trucks, carting the wheat out of the paddocks. And of course, it's been stinking hot. It's got a bit cold in the last few days, but really hot. It's dry, dusty work. And it's a family effort, and everybody else seems to find a sealed, silent, air-conditioned cabin, including my wife, who often drives the chaser bin, picking up the wheat. My daughter-in-law drives a combine harvester because they're better than the blokes. They're so gentle on those massive machines, they smash them up less. And at the end of the day, I will say something like, oh, gee, it's pretty hot, isn't it? It's been a shocking day. And they'll look at me and say, oh, was it? As they, emerge clean and fresh out of these machines that look after them so well. John, thank you very much for your kind words. I appreciate them hugely. I particularly appreciate what you had to say about trust. The breakdown of trust is an enormous threat to our society and to our freedoms. Because when we feel that we can't trust those around us to do what they ought to do without coercion, we go for the rule book. And we're bound up in more and more and more legislation because we no longer assume that enough of those around us will do the right thing. And that very remarkable book of yours, many books I recommend, and this is one of you haven't read it, something about Lazarus. You had a picture of the two of us and you said, the comment you had was to the effect that we trusted each other completely. And that to me was gold and meant a huge amount and still does. I often pinch myself and say, was I really so fortunate as to have served with two men of the character and ability and really all-round solidarity and character as Peter Costello and John Howard in what you won't be surprised to hear me say this, still believe was a very good government. It was an enormous honour. Two men who passionately believed in the importance of good public policy for the nation that they and I and you are also deeply committed to. John, it fell to me this year to be the raconteur in Canberra at the National Archives of Australia as they prepare for the release of the 2000 Cabinet Papers on January 1. And the deal is that quite a few select members of the media are given embargoed copies. There's an official historian who has said nice things, I think I can say that much, about the depth and capability of the government that you headed up. Which is very nice. A couple of things she takes issue with, which I dare say you'll learn about on the 1st of January. But I was thinking of you. That was one of the year of the Olympics, of course. And amongst other things, we had quite a debate in Cabinet, I think I can say this now, about how to protect the name of a man that most of us revere, you do in particular, Donald Bradman. everybody wanted to attach their name to whatever tacky piece of merchandise it was that they wanted to sell during the Olympics and what have you, and we had quite a discussion about it. And I got to thinking, and I just had a wander through the Bradman Museum only a few weeks before that, the way in which, John, you reflected so well the qualities that we remember him for quite apart from his sportsmanship, in that he was so modest in victory, gracious in defeat, but there was something else. Bradman was astonishingly intentional and determined to pursue whatever it was in his life that he was focused on at any given time, and that reminded me of you as well, John. Now, John Howard understood deeply that a major task for a democratic leader is to foster unity and a common sense of purpose and destiny wherever possible amongst the people being led. The nation in the end is no more and no less than the sum total of the individuals that make it up. And leading a democratic nation forward is only possible to the extent that trust and cooperation and a commitment to the broader good, as well as one's own self-interest, are extant in the people. And John was a leader who clearly held a strong set of convictions about where he felt the country should be going. He was able to convey that vision through skilled and patient advocacy, and he had about him the personal qualities necessary to persuade people to work with him to achieve those ends. He was also known to express the view that the things that unite us are far stronger and more durable and enduring than the things which divide us. Now, I think that all of us here tonight, in one form or another, would share with him a deep love of liberal democracy, which secures the four freedoms that Franklin Roosevelt and our own Bob Menzies, notably from both sides of the centre divide, or from each side of it, spoke of. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The vigorous pursuit and defence of these freedoms unquestionably aids the journey towards a flourishing and harmonious society, and indeed surely constitutes the reasons that so many have been attracted to the West itself and to the Western model. Yet, my friends, I think we all share a deep concern that those elites who hold the bulk of the microphones and, it seems, the cultural heft in the West today seem determined to divide us, not unite us, at every possible turn. We are, it seems, at war with one another. Men versus women, race versus race, generation against generation. David Brooks, author of another book I would recommend if you've not read it, The Road to Character, describes the West as more polarised, tribalised and distrustful than ever. And he makes the powerful argument that these now constitute our primary political problem because they make it increasingly difficult to develop and then implement good public policy on all the major challenges that confront us. Many people point to the advent of social media and its power in the modern political pantheon, but in reality, of course, it serves mainly as an amplifier for these underlying attitudes and the way in which people behave. A very powerful amplifier, but not so much the core problem as one which provides a means for ever louder megaphones. Once then, the obstacles to reform and progress were essentially political, where people argued out policies on the basis of evidence and facts and reason, often with great heat, but nonetheless on reasonably rational grounds, whereas today they are increasingly cultural. Appeals to the common or greater good based on evidence and reasoned debate fall foul of emotion, the outright denial of evidence all too often, and an unprecedented degree of tribalism. Indeed, I'd put it to you that the very laws of this land now that we live in reflect this new tribalism. The never-ending plethora of human rights law and machinery that started in the Whitlam era well-intentioned as some of it might have been, in reality encourage us to a selfish approach to competing and often conflictual claims to our rights, all too often at the expense of someone else. As Salvador Babones has said in his book, The New Authoritarianism, the right to pursue happiness has somehow transitioned into a right to be happy. And the further we go down the convoluted and legalistic rights-based approach, the more complexities we create and the less we see of simple, decent respect for one another and the right to our beliefs, our values and our own conscience. All too often now, self-assured technocrats, the expert class that so clearly think they know what is good for us, decide whose rights will prevail when they compete, and all too often the law and the courts will fall into line. That respect for one another, even when it has been, for example, simply the begrudging acknowledgement that that neighbour of mine down there is a bit quirky, but he's entitled to his views, even though I don't like them, has been critical to the success of the Western model of rubbing along. Yet a frightening new authoritarianism, to quote Babones, that rejects our traditional approach to individual dignity and freedom is taking hold. Neil Ferguson, the eminent economic historian, believes that we are living through the end of 500 years of Western ascendancy. He sees the three greatest threats to the West as being in ascending order, radical Islam, the possibility of miscalculation between the reigning superpower and the rising superpower, but most critically, the greatest as being the rejection of the history and legitimacy of our own culture. And he observes that if we could recover our own sense of ballast and balance, those other issues would be a very great deal easier to deal with. Now, Marx famously observed that a people cut off from their history are easily persuaded. Yet we have ensured that we no longer, and our children no longer, understand our own cultural roots. We deny our past achievements, and we overstate and misrepresent our past mistakes to suit modern narratives and modern agendas rather than the truth. And we have lost faith in ourselves at the very time in which those who wish us ill are full of all conviction, as Yeats had it. Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay have published a book which I want to suggest to you should be on everyone's Christmas reading list, called Cynical Theories. Some of you may have seen it. You can also find a conversation I held with these two people on my website. It went up this afternoon. They are two of the three people who wrote 20 spoof academic papers and put them out to periodicals, and you may recall that 11 of them were published. The one that caught my imagination, if not fancy, was the one that was entitled "What We Can Learn About Rape Culture by Observing Canines in Public Places." And it was published in a serious journal. But these two of the remarkable three people have put this book together. Steven Pinker, no less, has written of it. Many people are nonplussed by the surge of wokery, social justice welfare, intersectionality and identity politics that has spilled out of academia and inundated other spheres of life. Where did it come from? What ideas are behind it? This book exposes the surprisingly shallow intellectual roots of the movement that appear to be engulfing our culture. Have you heard that language is violent and that science is sexist? Or been told that being obese is healthy, that there is no such thing as biological sex, or that only white people can be racist? Are you confused by these ideas, and do you wonder how they have managed so quickly to challenge the very logic of Western society? I commend it to you. And here's a riddle for you. What exactly is intersectionality? And how did we as taxpayers come to spend $4.5 million trying to establish whether or not the campus of the University of Sydney was a safe place for people of intersectionality? I'm not going to try and answer it for you. I just posed the question. But the authors who unpack critical theory very carefully reveal just how frighteningly pervasive this whole concept or set of concepts has become. They write that we've reached a point in history where the liberalism and modernity at the heart of Western civilization are at great risk on the level of the ideas that have sustained us. The academic doctrines known as critical theory underpin what we've come to call identity politics. And those who have come to see the true nature of the world, enlightened by critical theory, are said to have been awakened, or, taking from the African-American vernacular, woke. So there you go, that's where it comes from. According to Pluckrose and Lindsay, postmodernism, which ran its course, and critical theory, which in a sense follows in its footsteps, rejected Christianity and Marxism and all other great political philosophies, but it also rejects science, reason, and the pillars of post-Enlightenment democracy. The same, of course, can be said for wokeism, which is merely the popularisation of the messages of postmodernism and critical theory preached, as many of you may have suspected if you had been watching these things, in universities very widely over the last generation. It's now everywhere, and it's frighteningly persuasive in our schools, in our universities, our media, the entertainment centre, dare I say it as someone from the bush, in many of our boardrooms. And it is plainly affecting our politics in very real ways. Identity politics, based as it is on critical theory, tries, as Lindsay and Pluckrose put it, to dismantle structures and institutions and revolutionise on a cultural level. It tends to believe that society is organised into systems of power and dominance. Furthermore, it actually openly condemns liberal democracy with all of its rights and freedoms as an elaborate and well-disguised way of oppressing women and racial and cultural and sexual minorities. How on earth do we understand it? Can I say to you, I don't find it easy. But there are many excellent minds that have grappled with it and written about it. And I can say this to you, I think, quite safely. There are four identical or identifiable features that help us understand this. Firstly, this movement sees the basic unit of analysis not as the individual, as liberalism has it, or economic class, as Marxism has it, but in the newer identities of race, of gender, and of sexuality. In several respects, the shift away from the individual to the collective isn't just academic in its implications. We must remember that principally the modern liberal democratic order is premised on the notion of the dignity of the individual, so that individual rights should only be interfered with in situations of clear and present danger. If you haven't been thinking about that quite a bit this year, you should have been. This is entirely alien to historical political arrangements that see society not in terms of individuals, but in terms of one or other of various class masses. The ultimate object of state protection is the collective, which means that individual rights are either non-existent or defined wholly in terms of what is deemed by the political elites of the day, in whatever system it is, as being in the interests of the whole, if not narrowly the party. Now here's the point. Inevitably, in such societies, individual rights are always deemed to be in tension with the collective. Witness the fate of free speech, religious liberty, freedom of association, the freedom not to associate, and economic liberty in every society that has ever existed that privileged the collective over the individual. History, I put it to you, is our best guide here, a far better teacher than philosophy and many of the governmental and political courses, I suspect, that are run in our educational institutions. Can I just add then when you start to talk about individuals, well-meaning people often say, that sounds selfish. And to those who want to say that, I just remind them that many powerful speakers, Locke, Jefferson, Mill, Robert Menzies, emphasised that every individual has dignity and every individual must recognise the dignity in others. The doctrine of the individual is not a selfish doctrine. It's far from it. It says that if I matter, I must respect the fact that you matter and have dignity and worth as well. But again, so individualism should never be confused with selfishness. I think it's a really important point for us to understand and to make. But once analysis shifts from the individual to the collective, one's loyalty becomes monopolised by the collective. And ultimate loyalty is owed to the party that claims to represent the collective. In liberal democracy, you and I enjoy many loyalties to our families, to our consciences, to our beliefs, to our communities, to the country that we live in. And liberal democracy historically recognises multiple loyalties, as evidenced in the practice, for example, of allowing conscientious objection to participation in war. No such plurality of loyalties is permitted once the notion of individual dignity and rights is set aside in favour of the collective or the tribe. Now, the second feature, identifiable feature of identity politics, is that it sees our society as merely a theatre of struggle. Life is about struggle. All relations are power relations. I thought many of them were love or commitment or loyalty-based, but no, according to this theory, they're all power relations. Everyone is either a victim or a victim maker, an oppressor. Now, this is partly inspired, of course, by the Marxist analysis of relationships. It has to a large extent carried over to identity politics. In fact, I think you could probably say identity politics lies halfway between individualism and communistic collectivism. It is, in fact, tribalism. The third identifiable characteristic is a simple one. All inequality of outcome is because of discrimination. And Robin DiAngelo, perhaps the widest read purveyor of identity politics today, in her bestseller, it's sold some astonishing number of copies, White Fragility, puts it this way: if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity of condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. You can imagine the totalitarian state you would have to set up to ensure that everybody was absolutely equal in every possible way, including the condition that they found themselves in. Fourthly, identity politics seeks to overthrow social conventions, institutions, rules and practices. The tearing down of statues is a powerful reflection of the determination to reject the notion of Western civilization. The grim determination to insist that gender is a social, not a biologically based construct, attacks the foundational place of science and of reason in our culture. As Edmund Burke said in reference to the French Revolution, rage and fury will pull down more in half an hour than prudence, deliberation and foresight can build up in 100 years. The impact on our children can only be concerning as the new thinking strips away all the old verities and certainties and insists that we find our own new identity, each of us, in the new world by self-referencing, self-defining ourselves with, if I can put this delicately, if many have their way, not so much as a guide as to even whether we are male or female to be recorded on our birth certificate. And when it all proves too much for too many of our children, there's always someone present to relieve them of their anxieties by assuring them that their real problem is that they are a victim. We see too in the attack on language, where ambivalence in language strikes me as the woke activist's best friend, as we face demands to use gender-neutral pronouns while the very meaning of words are flipped. so as to undermine the capacity for us to communicate and debate effectively with one another. Diversity turns out to really mean total uniformity of thought. Tolerance is eradicating traditional views. Love is punishing dissenters. Equality is one group dominating over the rest. Colourblindness is racist. And anti-racism turns out to be utterly and totally obsessed with race. The list goes on. The move to defund police in the United States provides a real insight into how wokeism is more about imposing an ideology than addressing real-world needs, despite the polling which shows very clearly that Americans in general and African Americans in particular do not want less policing. Social justice reforms, so-called, to policing in New York and Minneapolis have resulted in nasty spikes in violent crimes. Who do you think the most vulnerable might be? Well, a hint as to who they might be is the most common calls to police for help by people worried about violence are African American women. Where are the real priorities for some of these woke activists? As commentator Os Guinness has it, according to critical theory, the only factor that counts is power. Such an analysis is applied to all the categories of society in terms of gender, race, class and age. Once the victims are identified, they are to be weaponised, to be used in an assault on the status quo. That is not to say that there are not genuine victims. There are. But many genuine victims are overlooked as the protests mount, and only the victims that are useful to the left are proclaimed. There's an ugly new dogmatism here which is strong on absolutes like sin, but is not universal sin anymore. It's just so-called white supremacist sin. Little prospect of any redemption or of forgiveness, how any relationship can work at any level, in a marriage, in a family, in a community, in a nation, without the capacity to forgive, is ever offered by these people. And a culture that denies forgiveness and offers only condemnation, or even in this media age, the prospect of cancellation for those who dare to transgress, is a pretty ugly one. And when restitution and reconciliation are pursued without forgiveness, we face the very real prospect of a power conflict without end. And as Os Guinness points out, unless decisively checked, the result will be a backlash towards anarchy that will only reinforce a trend towards authoritarianism, because extremes always reinforce one another in the end. This movement plays very strongly on the great importance that many of us, and particularly our young people, place on empathy. Who could deny that a black life matters? Who could deny the idea of equality for women? But Canadian professor of psychology Jordan Peterson has often spoken profoundly on the mistake of transforming empathy from an important part of personal relationships into a justification for social policy. He warns us all, don't think an empathy culture will save you. You have to think. You can't just feel. Empathy is a fine value as far as it goes, but it can induce people to so identify with victims that it forces the retreat of rational analysis into both the actual claim of victimhood, are middle-class women or racial minorities in lucrative professions really oppressed, and whether the demands of the aggrieved are just or even good for the aggrieved person. Remember what I said earlier about defunding the police. In turn, because it tends so strongly to deny agency, the idea that people are responsible for their own actions, and that an attempt to rescue somebody in a difficult situation requires often help, but also a stepping up by those who presumably hope to escape their victimhood, the victim is painted as someone not responsible, no matter how they have behaved, for their plight, whether it's real or imagined. undiscerning empathy often tends to make it harder, not easier, to help real victims. And lest you think I'm sounding hard-hearted, I want to say to you it's incredibly important that we seek to be sympathetic to those who are in difficult situations, but sympathy may be a more valuable value than empathy, because whilst it allows us to identify with and feel the hurt of others, it also lets us rationally assess their claims, and that may be a lot more helpful in the long run. But the other really serious problem with identity politics is on its emphasis on groups rather than individuals. This is a really important point indeed. A person becomes righteous or wicked based purely on which gender or racial group they belong to. We draw the lines of virtue, if you like, not somewhere across every human heart, but according to which group you belong to. As Jonathan Haidt says, we are teaching our children to believe that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, weaker, I beg your pardon, that you should always trust your emotions, and that life is a battle between good people and bad people. Well, to say that a person becomes righteous or wicked based purely on which gender or racial group they belong to, I think is an extraordinarily dangerous idea. In the old days, in fact, we would have called it, and Martin Luther King would have called it too, racism, pure and simple. He wanted the colour of skin to be ignored. He wanted people to be judged on the content of their character, his children in particular. Nowadays, though, it's called social justice. Whole classes of the people then are cast as oppressors. The dividing line between good and evil is drawn between groups rather than somewhere across every human heart, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn had it. Identity politics can no more provide social unity than the historical injustices it claims to be solving. So, how do we find a better way forward? That's what matters. Perhaps we should begin with the Oracle of Delphi's injunction to know thyself. Each of us, I think, needs to make sure that we're not sleepwalking in the midst of all of this. We need to recognise just how powerful and how pervasive identity politics has become. And we need to carefully assess the degree to which we are being ourselves seduced or intimidated, or both, into accepting its dangerous sirens. I'm sure you will have heard, and I'm frankly often amazed by how often young people will say to me that they feel enormous pressure to be silent about what they really think, and they often feel pressured to say things that they do not believe to be true. What a sad reflection on where we've allowed our society to go to. Secondly, we must again learn our own history. The new activists have been able to powerfully deploy their monstrously revisionist versions of history as their most powerful weapon because so few can see, let alone understand, how they're being manipulated. The powerful weapon we can turn back against them then is the full story of our own culture. But we have to know it. We have to understand it. We have to believe it. No one pretends that that history is perfect. But liberal democracy has been by far the most effective political structure for human flourishing and for the ending of oppression. It's very easy to say that Western civilization is barbaric and oppressive, but just consider a brief list. The origins of modern science and medicine, emphasis on universal human dignity, the rule of law, the abolition of slavery, the introduction of religious toleration, freedom of speech, unprecedented prosperity and lifespans, equality of opportunity, rise of modern democracy, individual rights and the vote for women, particularly in this country, universal education for all classes, technology making life much easier, abundance of food, I had to put that in, and guaranteed clean drinking water. The list goes on. That's not exhaustive. And I'm not saying that these good things are not found elsewhere, but all of them originally found their genesis and their fullest expression here in the West. With this list, I'm not trying to denigrate the rest of the world. I'm just trying to remind cynical Westerners, for that's what we've become, that much that they'd hopefully agree constitutes great progress was driven by Western civilization as it unfolded. Our own country's story is quite powerful too. You know, we were founded with explicit instructions that there would be no slaves kept in Australia. Our colonies were some of the earliest modern democracies. We were second place in the world to give women the vote after New Zealand. And actually the legalisation of the vote, or the laws allowing for the vote in South Australia, were passed before they were actually exercised in New Zealand. So it's a bit of a moot point as to who really got there first. Early introduction of a decent limit on hourly working hours, daily working hours, and early nods towards decent living wages and an old age pension. And here's the point. Here's the point. These were fought for and won because of our ideals. Human dignity, freedom, equality, not in spite of them. Thirdly, we must support all of those who are developing the weaponry to fight back. In Australia, our greatest risk, I want to put it to you, may not be so much an empathy culture as an apathy culture. Certainly we don't want to fight those battles with the acrimony and increasingly violent tribalisation that characterises the American culture wars. But at the same time, we don't want to just capitulate in the way that seems to increasingly frequently happen, I'll offend someone here I'm sure, in two countries that I dearly love, Canada and the UK. Our history and our situation is unique, but we need to engage and do it in a civilised but firm and Australian way. We must actively support those who are on the front line of the battle for the soul of our culture, and the Menzies Research Centre, I want to say to you, is one of them, and a very important one. And I'm a huge admirer of Paul, of what your team, Nick and the rest of the crew do. Keep it up. It's incredibly important. And to all of us, support it. Even in the past few days, Nick Cade has written brilliant defences of religious liberty, the foundational liberty, actually, of liberal democracy, against new laws emerging in that extraordinary place to the south of us. To abandon the fight for religious liberty is to send a clear message to activists, to technocrats and to legislators: you can decide now what is most sacred for us. And I'm sorry, I don't want to live in a country where someone else decides what is most sacred for me. Let's also support existing institutions doing their best to teach the humanities in a more balanced way than they often are in the universities. I think particularly of the excellent work done at Campion College in Sydney, and the potential for enormous and positive impact from the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. But finally, let me conclude. We face another, perhaps to my way of thinking, even deeper problem than identity politics. It's the erosion of the foundations of belief in the human dignity that made Western progress possible in the first place. Recently, the historical foundations of Western progress have been illuminated by the brilliant British historian Tom Holland in his best-selling book Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. He says this: if secular humanism derives not from reason or from science, but from the distinctive course of Christianity's evolution, a course that in the opinion of growing numbers in Europe and America has left God dead, then how are its values anything more than the shadow of a corpse? What are the foundations of its morality, if not a myth? And our very own Menzies, a man of towering intellect, an extraordinary capacity to communicate, I find myself so envious of his abilities, made a similar point, albeit more narrowly related to our commitment to democracy, when he said this: but a true conception of democracy goes even beyond this. For democracy is more than a machine, it is a spirit. It is based upon the Christian conception that there is in every human soul the spark of the divine, that with all their inequalities of mind and body, the soul of men stand equal in the sight of God. The chief end of the state becomes man, man the individual, man the immortal spirit. In our secularised and pluralistic society, it is not clear, in fact it's very unclear, what the foundation of our belief in human dignity is. Some of you may simply say that we believe in human dignity because it works. Look at the results, you would say. But the question is how long we can hold this belief, given the attacks upon it, without the faith that originally justified it. Perhaps we can, perhaps we can't. Again, my best thought is to remind us all to fairly study our own history, and I would contend that if we study it fairly, we'll be awestruck at the achievements of the West. We will see the incredible legacy of the dialogue between Christianity and the classical world, which is my definition of the Western tradition. Perhaps we'll also be curious enough to reconsider the truth of the theological propositions that undergirded our belief in human dignity and thus our commitment to democracy and freedom. And I conclude by saying this: if we do so, we'll be uncovering a tradition that at its best will be a far greater foundation for unity, justice and freedom than critical theory and its spawn, identity politics, could ever be. Thank you.
Thank you, John Anderson, and on hearing a speech as powerful as that, my first reaction would normally be to text you and suggest you have this guy on your podcast. But since I can't do that, we've got the next best thing. It is the privilege of John Howard, as the man after whom these lectures are named, to have the first go at interrogating the speaker. And I'll pass over to him in a minute. I can assure you both, though, that I'm told this is Chatham House rules, that everybody in this room and the hundreds of people online around the world agree. So let it rip. Thank you.
John, can I say, this is a comment followed by a question, could I say that what really impressed me about that presentation tonight was that you gave intellectual flesh to what a lot of people are feeling, and you dragged it together in a very impressive way. And I think the point that you made most powerfully to me was to just look at the contribution of the West, and we shouldn't muck around. This assault that you talked about in identity politics is all about denigrating the centrality of Western civilisation to our being. And I mean, I was born in 1939, and the two great challenges of my lifetime were Nazism and communism. And in the end, both of them were brought down by the combined forces, not only of the military, but of the values of the nations that have stood at the centre of Western civilisation. So I suppose my question to you is, how do you think the contemporary exponents of liberal democracy around the world, the ones that should be carrying the burden of the fight more than anybody else, how do you think they're faring?
I'm encouraged because there are so many people tapping in so many ways now to try and get their minds around what's happening. Because this has snuck up on us, I think, to a very great degree. One of my neighbours, you know, an intelligent and thoughtful man, said to me, little boy, you're right, the Australian people are so pragmatic. He's got 3 kids. He's now beginning to realise a couple of years on what they're being exposed to at school and university. And it's not what he thought it was. And they're turning out to have very different values to the ones that he thought they would accept and imbibe, if I can put it that way. Peter Ruth once said of Tim Fisher, you don't listen to what Tim Fisher says so much as imbibe it. You may recall that. I was thinking, Tim had a quirky way of putting things. I'll tell you what I'm greatly encouraged by. It's the number of young people who are beginning to realise they've been sold a pup. And they're looking for answers. And the thing that most encourages me of all about the conversations is the young people who come up to me and say things like, you know, in my university, in my workplace, I have not felt able to own the things that I really think, and I haven't been able to speak out because I haven't known how to do it. And I'm finding now there are resources where I can tap into people who can unpack it for me and give me the arguments. So I'm massively encouraged by that. I don't think we're doing very well at all. I think our future is absolutely in the balance. I'll be quite frank with you, I really do. And I don't want to gild the lily on that. This is urgent stuff. I think Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay effectively say this new movement sees liberal democracy as its enemy. It's powerful, and only one's going to win. And we can't be too sure that it's going to be the good guys this time. I do think it's serious. But I'm encouraged by the number of people who are getting their minds around it, the young people who are waking up, the young people who are feeling cheated by what they've been fed and are looking for meat in place of gruel. The evidence of that, more than anything else, for me, happened a couple of years ago when I was asked to chair a meeting for Jordan Peterson at Chatswood. 1,000 people were hanging from the rafters, and around half of them, at least, were young Australian men. And I looked at them and I thought, they're the guys that would have lined up for the Cooee marches, the volunteers, the people we would have seen as the cream of our society. And they were, I'll tell you what was driving them. They know they're being painted not as victims, but as victim makers. And they're saying, no, we don't want to be victim makers, we want to be above this. Where's a better narrative? And so when he said to them, don't think an empathy culture can solve your problems, you solve them. Go back to your bedroom. You know that rhetoric, you've probably all heard it. Pull your shoulders back. Face the fact you're not the person you ought to be. Resolve to be as noble as you can, and then go back out there and do your best. And the fact that there were people packed to hear that man who was not a sportsman or a motivational, well, you could call him a motivational speaker, but he's much more than that, not some sort of international superstar. And social media meant that a young group of Australians knew all about him, and they give him a standing ovation before he said anything, and a standing ovation when he finished speaking, and another one. I mean, I felt very, I thought, I've been in the wrong profession. They love him. I found very profound and moving. And so my final comment out of that would be, mentor young people whenever you have the opportunity, because they are really hungry for it.
Do you think, John, just following up that, to what contribution do you believe to that, lost state that many young people feel, what contribution has been made to that over the years through the perceived decline of religious belief?
I think it's been a major contributor, and I was talking to a very thoughtful fellow with Nick over lunch today, where he was saying about my age, and he was just making the observation, and I think it was a very powerful one. He said, when we went to school, we learnt the great tenets of Christian faith, even if we didn't believe it. So the story of the Good Samaritan, love your neighbour, the golden rule, which undergirded the Western approach to thinking of others and doing unto others as you'd have them do unto yourself. The story of the prodigal son, you can return, lost on a younger generation. So I think it's been a very significant role, and I think I've played a very significant role. And I do think that there is a real thirst for something deeper and more meaningful. I don't know where it will land, but I would say this. The problem we have, in one way of looking at the problem we have at the moment, and I see it as a very serious one, is that our enemies, both within and without, are full of all conviction. Have you noticed that? There's a frightening absolutism amongst the people who hate Western culture inside our countries as well as outside our countries. And as Yeats had it, the best lack all conviction. That's why I'm saying, not lecturing to you, I'm saying to each one of us, to the best of our ability, we have to step up. We have to find that conviction. And that conviction ought to be rooted in the golden rule, loving your neighbour. We must avoid falling into the trap that the Americans have fallen into, where this polarisation is so vicious that you have what Arthur Brooks has called, and I think it's a really valuable insight, you see the anger, we all see that on our television sets, but it's been combined with disgust. And when you combine the two, you get contempt. And when you become contemptuous of one another, whether it's in a marriage or whether it's in a community or whether it's across political divides, rather than, if you like, strongly committed to opposing worldviews, but rather contemptuous personally of one another, you're in deep, deep trouble. So somehow we've got to fight this hydra-headed monster without losing our own civil commitment to civility.
I don't want to stop other people asking you questions, but your speech was a treasure trove of provocation to ask these sort of questions. But have you seen around the free world, the democratic world in recent times, examples of where identity politics has triumphed, and also examples of where it has fallen on its face?
John, I think I'd have to take that on notice. I'm sure there are a lot. But I would say that I think identity politics is capturing our politicians, because they've become so many of them are so nervous now about standing up for the things that we normally believe in. I think that's a very general answer, but I think it's massively distorting our politics, and I think that is really worrying. How many people they're there? We've got some. Look, I should edit this from the tape, but I'm really impressed by some of the people in our team in Canberra, particularly some of the Liberals, who really are beginning to speak out, show real courage, and to defend the things that we ought to defend. As Lionel Shriver wrote so effectively, it might have been a speech that I saw written up recently, the people who, people who turn out to the Black Lives Matter protests and what have you, and I know that there were people who did it out of good intent, but few of them had any idea of how they were really being taken for a ride by the people who organised that thing. At the end of the day, they will still want their mobile phone and their social media and their 3 square meals a day. And where are they going to find it if they smash the system that's delivered it for them in spades? And that's the danger that we're falling into. We have to think, not just feel.
But what do you think of the proposition that I think I hold to, that if Donald Trump had handled the pandemic half decently, he would have won the election, and that I think he was headed towards a victory until the pandemic hit, and it was his mishandling of that, because in the end the public, when threatened, want their leaders to defend them against the threat, and that is why you've had the phenomenon. Scott Morrison has very high approvals, Gladys Berejiklian has, our friend in Western Australia has, and even our friend in Victoria is surviving. He's more than surviving. He's quite perpendicular at the present time. Now, part of that is a perception that, difficult though it all was and so forth, he's sort of got the show through now. I mean, I think he's open to a lot of political attack, and I know this is not a political occasion. I shouldn't join in that attack, but I think there's something to be said for the proposition that, and this is an optimistic thing in a way, that the side of politics in America that embraced identity politics far more, namely the Democratic Party side, if you take out, I mean, sure, Biden won, but given how appallingly Trump handled the pandemic, how else could he not win? I mean, it was just every time he had a news conference, he was penning a political suicide note. I think he's handling it, and it was terrible. But if you look at the Congress, Republicans did far better than many people expected, and the same thing in the Senate. I draw a little bit of encouragement from that, not in a partisan sense. I normally am more sympathetic to the Republicans than I am to the Democrats, but I think probably there was a middle American rejection to be found in that election outcome, notwithstanding the fact that Trump won. And I think you're starting to see it reflected in Biden's choice of people who will serve in his administration. They're not as left-wing and as embracing of political correctness as you might expect.
Not for the first time. I enjoy you reinforcing my prejudices. That's a throwback. When I gave my maiden speech in August 1989, John was kind enough to come in and listen to it. He came over afterwards and shook my hand warmly and said, "I enjoyed that. I always love having my prejudices reinforced." Yeah. So it is I share the view.
Yeah, I've been thrown out of the leadership a few months earlier, but
Yeah, I arrived in Canberra, was sworn in, and 2 days later, both my leader and the Liberal Party changed leaders. I was beginning to wonder what I'd done, or what power I had. I soon to discover none was the answer. But look, I actually completely agree. I mean, when you look at it, if he'd not mishandled COVID, Trump would have been returned.
He would have, yeah.
And I think it is forever to the how would I put it? It's forever a black mark against the American media and the Australian media that they were so poor at analysing policy and what he actually did and so intent upon describing him as such a terrible person that they have a great deal to answer for. And particularly in Australia, there was very little analysis of where Australia's interests lay in these very difficult times. But I think you're absolutely right. The American people, an astonishing number of people voted for him despite that behaviour and the disappointments.
And despite the fact that he did have a lot of flaws.
Yeah. And then they chose to reduce the Democrats' numbers in the House.
Mm.
And, well, we don't know until the runoff in Georgia, where I'm told the great probability is that whoever wins will win both. But the Republicans need at least one to continue to control the Senate. So it's a very important runoff for the globe. I mean, what happens in American politics is probably as important to us now at this point in history as what happens here. But I go back to the point that I made. You have to admire the Americans for engaging in the debate. You can't stand back anymore. I mean, all my instincts are, John will know that this is true, and my wife will know it's true, and the rest of you will say you're talking through your hat. But I'm essentially a very shy person who's really happier driving wheat trucks. But I am so motivated by what I see as the real potential for us to lose our freedoms, and so despairing at our lack of, am I allowed to say manning up in the face of this? I'm probably not. What else can I say? Humanising up. Whatever. Rising to the challenge. Now, see, there's a touch of wokeism in everyone. That I just feel, it's all hands to the wheel. Can I say to you, I don't think any of us can ask anymore what would I like to do. We need to ask, what can I do? I really say that to you really seriously. I say that to you as friends, as people that I'm honoured to have been asked to speak to tonight and hopefully stimulate a bit of thinking. It really matters. It really matters. And we can be thankful that the Americans then, this is my point, are engaged. And as another good friend of mine, Kim Beazley, is a man I really do like, and I talked to him over in Western Australia a while ago, had a long time in America. He said, we miss the strength of middle America because we get the media and the Hollywood version, or what Victor Davis Hanson calls the drone view, with all the people from the West Coast and the East Coast who have become millionaires in the tech age as they sort of swan over the country and sort of refer to the hoi polloi down there. But the real America, there's still strength and determination and character and backbone and community there. And they have plainly said, sorry, Donald, you just went a little bit too far, or enough of them have, but by heck, don't you think, Joe, we're going to give you the keys to the, do what you want, what the left wing of your party wants to do. So Georgia will be important, and we hope that Joe, who's not young, stays as fit, healthy, and as with it as humanly possible for this term.
You don't want his deputy either.
No.
Well, I don't want to monopolise the interrogation. I don't want to stop other people, but unless there's... No, Nick?
What other questions?
No, I haven't. I've got plenty of questions. John, it's obvious from what you said in your speech that the narrative in our educational institutions is a big worry.
Yeah.
I mean, you're aware of the argument that was advanced by academics in the Australian National University and also the University of Sydney, opposing the program that was put forward by the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. And I declare it interesting in that I'm chairman of that body. And it is extraordinary to me that the argument that was used was that arguing for the virtues and the historical contribution of Western civilisation the argument that was used by the opponents of Ramsay in those two institutions was that in some way what we were talking about was a sense of triumphalism, that it was all about the triumphal march of Western civilisation and denying the contribution of other civilisations. And it seems to me that the biggest problem we have is the way in which the narrative in institutions, in universities, in both government and independent schools. Don't anybody imagine that independent schools are in any way. You know, I've heard stories that some of the greatest rot in this context is taught in independent schools and schools that carry religious labels. You know, particularly from some more mature-aged former pupils of those same schools, and I think this is the biggest problem. And what, in your view, is some of the things that governments of the right mind can do about that? Because I think it's the biggest problem by far.
Well, again, reinforcing one another's prejudices, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And one of the remarkable things about this movement is that it can never acknowledge progress. See, one of the great things about liberal democracy is that we've corrected so many wrongs. We've found it, I tried to make that point tonight, that we've found it in ourselves to say, when it's ridiculous not to give women the vote. Of course it's wrong for women to be not equally paid. Of course slavery's wrong. We've found it within ourselves because of our beliefs and values and our understanding of the dignity of individuals. I mean, Lincoln understood that the American people were in serious contravention of the stated beliefs about the self-evident truths of, you know, the value of all people and what have you in the great slavery debate in that country. But Britain had got there a long way before. And I'm indebted to a very clever writer in Quadrant, by the way, who pointed out, you know, this argument about slavery and racism and white supremacy, it's just so misleading. The African slave trade was based on slaves on the West trade purchased for trinkets, as you know, on the West coast of America. From whom? African slave traders who'd gone themselves into the inland, murdered the infants and the infirm and the aged, rounded up the rest, taken them back to the coast and sold them. Now, there were whites who participated in that dreadful and evil trade, but there were whites who ultimately succeeded in getting rid of it. Were they all racist? But this was a story about Quadrant, 17,000 sailors in the Royal Navy lost their lives when Britain said, there was no United Nations in those days, of course, we're going to seek to end the slave trade around the world. So we'll intercept slave traders on the high seas. 17,000 white Royal Navy sailors died freeing or seeking to defend the rights of Negroes, of blacks. Were they racist? So the point that I'm making is that the reason they won't open the door, they keep it jammed shut, is that they don't want people denying the woke narrative that we are evil and our system is broken and it must be overthrown. I think it's really important we understand that. The minute you let the light in and say, well, actually, we've achieved a fair bit and we've been self-correcting and we've been able to right wrongs, and it's because of our value system and because of the heroes of the past. And I'm sorry, I'll start quoting Churchill in a moment, but in 1934 he said this, and Nick down the back will say, John, you quote it too often, they'll be bored stiff. I'm sorry, bear with me for a moment. He wrote in 1934 that any culture which does not pass on to its children an understanding of its history, and in particular its beliefs and its heroes, is in effect saying that that past is null and void, thus leaving its young, his words not mine, without purpose and direction and meaning in life, and open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people separated from their history are easily persuaded. Well, boy, our young people have been easily persuaded. But my point earlier is that enough of them are waking up because it's gone too far. They're now being painted as victim makers, particularly the young men, and they're saying we're not. Churchill also said you can learn all you need to know about statecraft from the study of history, and the more you want to see into the future, the further you should look to the past. I'm indebted, talking of prime ministers, to a friend of mine who gave me a book of things that he really said and the things he didn't say, you know, all those Churchill quotes. And there was a beauty in there, former Prime Minister, that you might appreciate. Those remarkable speeches that he gave early in the war, because there was no recording equipment. So he had to rush off to BBC studios to make them as addresses to the nation. And one of them, they rushed up out of the War Cabinet offices under, where is it? They're still there. You can, and Thompson, his bodyguard, and somebody from his office there, they hailed down a cab and said, "Quick, Gov, can you take us to the BBC studios?" And the bloke said, the cabbie said, "Sorry, Gov, it's in the wrong direction. I've got to get home to get to be with the missus to listen to the Prime Minister." Which Thompson, without a word, pulled out a fresh fiver and said, would this help persuade you? And the cabbie looked at it and he said, "Oh, Gov, that makes all the difference. Bugger the Prime Minister, jump in." Excuse the French. And turned around and took him back and probably heard the thing live.
For those of people in the room, there'll be opportunities to contribute and talk later. But thank you so much for delivering this lecture. This has been the best event the Menzies Research Centre's done in months. In fact, it's the only event. But we're looking forward to next year to getting back to more of these things. And negotiations start straight after this lecture about who next year's John Howard Lecture Director will be. But that's all from us at the Menzies Research Centre. Thank you for being here and thank you for supporting us, and good night.